That was the first coherent thought Jedediah Stone had in 2 days. It wasn't the lazy drone of a summer bee or the high-pitched whine of a mosquito. This was a low, vibrational hum, a sound that felt like it was resonating deep within his own skull. It was the sound of a nest, a hive, a ghastly symphony of life where it had no right to be. He tried to lift his hand to swat at his ear, but his arm felt like a lead weight. A faint, sweet, and sickly smell. The odor of a butcher's shop left open in the sun filled his nostrils. He peeled open a crusted eyelid. The ceiling of his small fishing cabin was a blurry white. The buzzing grew louder, a grinding, pulsating thrum that seemed to emanate from the bandage on his leg, from deep within his own flesh. That was the moment the screaming began. Dr. Aris Thorne hated the humidity of the Florida Panhandle. It felt parasitic, a thick, wet blanket that clung to her skin and made the air too heavy to breathe. She stepped out of her government-issue sedan, the blast of heat of physical assault. Before her stood the Havenwood Community Clinic, a low-slung building that looked more like a forgotten VFW hall than a place of healing. Her encrypted satellite phone had rung at 3 a.m. The voice on the other end belonged to a frantic small-town doctor named Ben Carter. His words were a jumbled mess of panic and disbelief. "It's not a staph infection at not Marseille. God, Aris, it's moving. The tissue is moving." Aris was a lead entomological investigator for the CDC's Special Pathogens branch. Her specialty was vectors, the insects that carry disease. Most of her work involved tracking rare mosquito-borne viruses or containing outbreaks of tick-related fever. But the terror in Carter's voice had a different texture. This wasn't about a pathogen. This was about a predator. Inside, the clinic was chaos in miniature. A handful of nurses scurried about, their faces pale. Dr. Carter, a man who looked like he'd aged a decade since their phone call, grabbed her arm. His hand trembled. "In here," he whispered, leading her to the single quarantine room. "He came in 3 days ago, a fishing injury, laceration on his shin from a rusty boat hook. We cleaned it, stitched it, sent him home with antibiotics." He paused at the door, taking a shaky breath. "Yesterday, his neighbor brought him back in. He was delirious, fever of 104. The leg, oh God, the leg." Aris pushed the door open. The smell hit her first. A coppery, rotten odor that spoke of profound tissue death. Necrosis. On the bed lay Jedediah Stone, his body convulsing under a thin sheet. His lower leg was a grotesque mockery of a human limb. The bandage was soaked through with a brownish-red fluid, and from beneath its edges, a horrifying pulsation was visible, the source of the buzzing. "Has anyone changed the dressing?" Aris asked, her voice calm and clinical, a carefully constructed dam against the horror. "We tried," Carter stammered. "He screamed so loud we thought he'd have a coronary, and the things, they started pouring out." "Things?" Aris pulled on a pair of nitrile gloves, then another for good measure. She approached the bed. With a pair of sterile forceps, she gently began to peel back the saturated gauze. The buzzing intensified, a furious, angry vibration. As the bandage came away, the sight beneath it defied all medical reason. The wound was no longer a simple cut. It was a crater, a teeming, writhing cauldron of off-white maggots. But these weren't the passive larvae of a common blowfly, feeding on what was already dead. These were thick, muscular, and horrifyingly active, each one armed with 2 distinct black mouth hooks that they used to tear and burrow. They were actively consuming the living flesh of the man's leg, their bodies packed so tightly into the cavity that their collective movement made the entire wound appear to breathe. This was a case of advanced aggressive myiasis, a parasitic infestation of living tissue by fly larvae. "Get me a sample jar and a basin of peroxide solution." "Now," Aris commanded, her voice sharp. Dr. Carter fumbled for the supplies. Aris used her forceps to pluck one of the squirming larvae from the wound. It was larger than any common maggot she had ever seen, segmented and powerful. Under the harsh clinical light, she could see the distinct rings of spines on its body that allowed it to anchor itself deep within the host's tissue. A cold dread, a recognition from the deepest, darkest pages of her textbooks, washed over her. "Carter," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Look at the spiracles." She pointed to the posterior end of the larva. The breathing plates. That pigmentation, the pattern. This isn't just any myiasis. She held the writhing thing up to the light. The memory from a biohazard briefing slide flashed in her mind, obligate parasite. Will not lay eggs in dead tissue, exclusively targets living warm-blooded animals. "This is Cochliomyia hominivorax," she breathed. The name felt like a curse on her tongue. "The new World Screwworm." Carter's face went white. "But that's impossible. It was eradicated from the United States in the 60s. There hasn't been a case here in decades." "Apparently," Aris said, dropping the still writhing larva into the sample jar. "It's back." The New World Screwworm was a monster of biology, a flesh-eating parasite of unparalleled efficiency. The female fly, with its metallic emerald green body and orange face, would find even the smallest paper cut or mosquito bite on a warm-blooded host. There she would lay a clutch of 200 eggs. Within a day, the larvae would hatch and immediately begin their gruesome work, burrowing headfirst into the living flesh, tearing at muscle and sinew with their hook-like mandibles. As the wound festered and grew, its scent would attract more female flies, leading to a geometric progression of infestation. A single untreated case could result in thousands of larvae in one host, leading to a painful, agonizing death from toxicity and secondary infection. And now, this eradicated biological horror was nesting in a man's leg in Havenwood, Florida. "We need to quarantine the clinic," Aris said, her mind racing, shifting from diagnosis to containment. "No one in or out. Contact state authorities. I'm declaring a level 4 biohazard. We need a federal team here yesterday." But it was already too late. As Carter scrambled to the phone, a nurse burst into the room, her eyes wide with terror. "Doctor! It's Martha Jensen from the next street over. She's on the ground in her garden. Her nose, God, her nose is bleeding and crawling." The outbreak had already begun. Within 24 hours, Havenwood was a town under siege. The National Guard had set up a perimeter, a 5-mile circle of steel and armed soldiers around the town. Nothing and no one was getting out. A mobile CDC field laboratory was airlifted in, a sterile white tent city that blossomed in the high school football field. This was no longer an isolated medical case. It was an epidemiological crisis. Aris Thorne was at the epicenter. She and her hastily assembled team worked around the clock, trying to understand the scope of the disaster. They had 7 confirmed cases of screwworm infestation by nightfall. Martha Jensen, the gardener, had a small scratch on her face from a rose bush. A child had fallen and scraped his knee. A farmer had an infected blister on his hand. Every case was a terrifying testament to the fly's predatory efficiency. "The vector's behavior is wrong," Aris muttered, staring at a map of Havenwood dotted with red pins marking infestation sites. Her second-in-command, a grizzled virologist named Kenji Tanaka, nodded grimly. "An ordinary hominivorax fly is opportunistic but cautious," Kenji said, pointing at the map. "These cases are too widespread, too fast. It's acting more aggressively than the literature suggests, almost like it's actively hunting." The true horror of their situation became clear when they analyzed the larvae from Jedediah Stone and compared them to the ones from Martha Jensen. The genetics were a match, but with a terrifying anomaly. "There's a synthetic protein marker in their mitochondrial DNA," a young geneticist on their team reported. his face ashen. "It's not natural. It looks like a remnant from a CRISPR-Cas9 edit. Someone engineered these." The words hung in the air of the lab, more chilling than any ghost story. This wasn't a natural reemergence. This wasn't a case of a few flies crossing the border on an infected animal. This was an act of bioterrorism, or an experiment gone catastrophically wrong. The people of Havenwood, trapped within the quarantine zone, began to panic. Fear was a more potent vector than any fly. The local sheriff, a pragmatic man named Wade Coombs, was struggling to maintain order. Aris's team worked feverishly, debriding the wounds of the infected, a gruesome, painstaking process of manually extracting every single larva with forceps. It was medieval medicine in the face of a futuristic threat. For Jedediah, it was too late. The massive larval burden had led to systemic toxicity. He died, his body a hollowed-out shell. His death sent a fresh wave of terror through the town. The true nightmare began on the third night. "Dr. Thorne, you need to get to the western perimeter. Bring your people." The scene at the edge of town was apocalyptic. The powerful floodlights of the military blockade illuminated a scene straight out of a Bosch painting. The swamps at the edge of Havenwood were alive. Dozens of deer, raccoons, and wild boar stumbled out of the darkness, their bodies ravaged. Some were missing eyes, replaced by writhing nests of larvae. Others had gaping wounds on their flanks, pulsating with the same horrifying life that had consumed Jedediah Stone. They were walking incubators, but worse, far worse, was the sound, the swarm. Now, they're organized. They're moving like a single entity. He was right. In the beams of the floodlights, Aris could see them, a shimmering emerald green cloud that pulsed and shifted in the humid night air. Millions upon millions of Cochliomyia hominivorax. The swarm was a superorganism, and Havenwood was its feeding ground. A deer, its mind destroyed by the infestation burrowing into its sinuses, charged blindly toward the barricade. It hit the chain-link fence with a wet thud and collapsed, a fresh cloud of iridescent green flies descending upon it. "This is an extinction-level event in miniature," Kenji whispered, standing beside Aris. "Whatever that genetic marker did, it didn't just make them aggressive, it gave them hive intelligence. They were no longer just fighting a parasitic fly. They were fighting a coordinated, intelligent predator with millions of bodies. A biological horror that could replicate at an exponential rate. Where is the nest? A swarm this size needs a focal point." Sheriff Coombs overheard her. "There's a place, a few miles deep in the swamp, an old cattle research facility run by a biotech corporation that went bust about 5 years ago. Agrigenics Bioresearch." It was a long shot, but it was the only shot they had. The swarm was growing, and Aris knew it was only a matter of time before they overwhelmed the quarantine. If that swarm broke free and reached a major population center like Miami, the consequences would be unimaginable. "I need a small team," Aris announced, her voice filled with a resolve she didn't feel. "Sheriff, I need you to guide us. Kenji, you're with me. We're going to the source." The journey into the swamp was a descent into hell. The air was thick with the buzzing, a constant, sanity-shredding drone that vibrated in their teeth. They wore full-body hazmat suits, but it did little to quell the psychological terror. The swamp itself was dying. The abandoned Agrigenics facility was a collection of rust-streaked metal buildings. A faded sign read, "Engineering a Better Tomorrow." The central building's doors had been torn from their hinges. Inside was devastation. Lab equipment was smashed, and on the floor were the desiccated remains of several lab workers, and in the center of the main lab was the source, a massive cylindrical containment vessel shattered from the inside. A thick, protein-rich nutrient gel coated the floor, and lying in it were the carcasses of several surgically altered cows. They had been used as living bioreactors. "This was it," Kenji breathed. "They were trying to engineer a sterile male fly. But they must have unlocked something else, something in the hive instinct genes. A sudden, deafening roar of buzzing erupted as a section of the wall collapsed inward and the swarm poured through. It was a solid, shimmering wall of emerald green death. "Run!" Coombs yelled, firing his shotgun into the mass to no effect. They sprinted through the decaying facility, the swarm hot on their heels. It was thinking, cutting off hallways, pouring through vents. Kenji shoved Aris through a doorway into a control room, and Coombs slammed it shut, barricading it with a fallen steel locker. The sound of millions of flies hitting the door was like a torrential hailstorm. "We're not getting out," Coombs said, reloading his shotgun with grim finality. Aris ignored him, her eyes scanning the control panel. Most of it was dead, but one system flickered with emergency power. Thermogenic sterilization protocol. "Kenji, look! It's a failsafe. They could flood the entire facility with superheated gas." "It's not powered up, Aris. The main generator is dead," Kenji countered. "The backup generator," Aris said, her eyes tracing a thick cable. "It has to be nearby. If we can get it started, I can initiate the sequence from here." The plan was suicidal. Before Aris or Kenji could volunteer, Sheriff Coombs checked the last shell in his shotgun. He looked at them, his face etched with a strange calm. "My town, my people," he said simply. "Tell my wife. Tell her I went fishing." He unsealed his helmet. "Keep that door shut until you hear the generator kick on. Then you have 2 minutes to get to the extraction point. This fire will draw them all here. It'll be your only chance." He didn't wait for an argument. He kicked open the door and charged out, shotgun blazing, a final defiant roar swallowed by the all-consuming buzz of the swarm. Aris and Kenji watched in horror. A few seconds later, the lights in the compound flickered. Then, with a loud groan, the generator kicked on. The control panel in front of Aris lit up, thermogenic sterilization ready. With tears streaming down her face, Aris slammed her hand down on the activation button. A deep klaxon began to blare. A countdown appeared on the screen. 120 seconds. "Let's go," Kenji said, pulling her toward a maintenance hatch. "Let's not let him die for nothing." They scrambled out into the night, the roar of the swarm now focused entirely on the main building. They ran, gasping for air, stumbling through the mud. They didn't look back until they reached the tree line, just as the countdown hit 0. There was no grand explosion, just a deep, guttural whoosh as the facility's vents glowed a cherry red. A high-pitched, collective shriek of 1,000,000 incinerating insects filled the air for a moment, and then silence. The oppressive, soul-crushing buzzing was gone. In the aftermath, the official story was a masterpiece of misdirection. A mutated strain of screwworm, a natural phenomenon, successfully contained by a swift and effective CDC and military quarantine. Agrigenics was a footnote. Sheriff Wade Coombs was posthumously awarded for his heroism. Dr. Aris Thorne stood on a temporary airstrip, watching the last of the CDC equipment being loaded onto a cargo plane. The air was clean. The silence was beautiful, but she knew it was a lie. A black car pulled up beside her. A man in a simple dark suit got out. He didn't introduce himself. "Dr. Thorne," he said, his voice flat. "You will conclude this was a natural, albeit aggressive variant. Is that understood?" Aris stared at him, the faces of Jedediah Stone and Wade Coombs flashing in her mind. She thought of the body horror, the biological terror that had been unleashed. "I understand," she said, the words tasting like ash. "We can't have the public losing faith in progress." He got back in the car and was gone. Aris boarded her plane, the sole passenger. As the aircraft climbed over the ruined swampland, she looked out the window. She felt a profound, bone-deep weariness, the kind that comes from staring into an abyss. They had stopped the outbreak. They had killed the swarm. It was over. But then she saw it. It was a brilliant, metallic green, its orange face turned toward her. It wasn't being blown away. It was holding on with an unnatural strength, its tiny legs anchored to the metal frame. As Aris watched, frozen in a fresh wave of ice-cold terror, it turned its head and began to patiently, methodically, probe the rubber seal of the window with its proboscis. It wasn't frantic. It was intelligent. It was testing a boundary, searching for a way in. The swarm was gone, but the queen, the survivor, the alpha, was right there, separated from her by a single inch of glass. And this time, there was nowhere left to run.